Unit 2, can you 98 with me in the back parking lot and give me a 1021 here en route?
As the sun goes.
So let's talk about 10 codes on the radio. Originally, 10 codes were created by law enforcement when the first radios came out. They were very, very primitive radios, and communication was not necessarily instantaneous. And so they developed essentially a shorthand for communication in the form of 10 codes, and that allowed them to say codes that meant certain things. Now radios have improved quite a bit, and there's an attempt to actually remove 10 codes from law enforcement, partially because of interagency operations. Not every police department uses the same 10 codes, and so this can create some confusion when they are trying to do an interoperation between agencies. And so they're trying to make a switch to plain English. And so the question is now, with security, there really isn't much opportunity for an interagency operation, but should security use 10 codes while communicating? And I think that the answer is a little mixed. Take a look at this list of 10 codes here. So one of the arguments in favor of using 10 codes is that it promotes officer safety and a little bit of secrecy in the communications on the radio. The counter argument to that is that, well, anybody can look up the meaning of those codes with relative ease. However, in my opinion, in the heat of the moment, if you're using a 10 code, you got a subject standing right in front of you, and you use 10 codes, they're not going to know what that 10 code necessarily means in that moment. And that could mean the difference between making them more agitated or escalated situation, because they don't know exactly what you're saying, versus plain English, where they would plainly understand what it is you're conveying on the radio. So in that case, I definitely believe 10 codes have their benefit and their use. Another one is a lot of times plain English just doesn't come out right, and a lot of times it's not very professional. And in my opinion, using 10 codes, or using the basic 10 codes like 10.1, 10.4, 10.9, and then 10.7 and 10.8, those are very common. Or 10.20, what's your location? 10.21, give me a phone call. 98 with me, or 97 on scene. Those are the common ones that are pretty much universal, with very little exception. Those are universal with most law enforcement agencies, and they're well understood. And it just gives you a little bit more of an air of professionalism on the radio. One of my pet peeves with security is listening to them talk on the radio, and they're talking like a bunch of drunken truckers sitting at a truck stop talking on their CB radios, and it's just wildly unprofessional. I've had coworkers gabbing on the radio while I'm trying to talk to somebody in a professional manner, and it's really embarrassing. I hate it. So I definitely think that radio etiquette is highly important, especially for the image of your company you're working for, just to maintain that professionalism. And if you are going to use plain English, slow down and think about what you're going to say before you key up on that radio, so that you're not sitting there with the hums and the haws and the uhs. And I know that I do that a lot. I'm guilty of that. I've gotten in a bad habit of saying quite a bit, and I'm working on getting that out of my vocabulary once again. Really, I think the biggest issue with the 10 codes is when you start getting into the more obscure 10 codes that people are not familiar with, it would most likely delay communications. And another thing to keep in mind is that when you're talking to, as a security officer, if you are making a call to police dispatch, don't use 10 codes, and don't use penal codes. When you're talking to them, use plain English, be as clear, as concise as possible. Allow them to direct the call. They're trained to ask the right questions, so don't try to give them the rundown, of what you think they want to know. Let them direct the call, and they will ask you the questions that they need to know. And It's more important that they get the information that they need rather than you sounding like you know what you're talking about. At this point, just be plain English, be as professional as possible, give them the information they ask for, don't try to give them anything extra. If they need to know more, they will either reach out to you, call you back, or have you stay on the line. But if you're calling law enforcement dispatch, just plain English is the way to go. And then when you're talking to an officer on scene, again, don't use 10 codes, don't use penal codes. Just when you first say there was a physical fight, don't say, oh, there was a 415 physical, or there was a 415 G, citing some California codes there. Use plain English. Say a gang fight, and don't try to sound like like you're a lingo expert. Just plain English. A lot of times they're going to look at you, and there may be some miscommunication there or misunderstanding of what you're saying, and that's just not a good situation when you're trying to communicate effectively. So another thing about the radio is that if you are trying to convey something important or critical, repeat it twice. So for example, officer need assistance at 123 Elm Street. Again, repeat it. Officer needs assistance, 123 Elm Street. And then you can give a brief indication of what's going on if you have the time to do so. But that should suffice. There is a code out there for dire need, and that's pretty well understood across most agencies, 1199. And even the place that I work, it's a documented code to use on the radio. It's extremely rare, but usually in law enforcement, when an officer calls 1199, that's a multi-agency response. It's a dire need, life or death situation, and so it's very rarely ever called. If you need assistance, plain English, way to go. But I definitely think that 10 codes do have their place. At least the basic 10 codes have their place to free up traffic, and just stay professional on the radio. You don't know who is listening on the other end. When I have a radio on my hip and I'm talking to somebody and the radio squawking off with a bunch of nonsense, it's just really unprofessional, and it makes me look bad. It makes the company look bad. So as guards, do better. Stay professional on the radios and keep your traffic to a minimum. You don't want that radio constantly talking, because the more the radio talks, the less people listen to it. Yeah, the more sound you hear coming out of the radio, the more it becomes background noise, and your brain automatically starts to tune out that sound. And so you may hear something come across the radio and not actually realize that it's radio, and you just end up ignoring the call. So keep radio chatter to a minimum. When talking on the radio, keep it short and sweet. Avoid rambling. Ideally, most communications you want to keep under 15 seconds, although 15 seconds does tend to be a long time. If you do talk for a while, you have the necessity of talking for a while, break it up into pieces. You can use the word break. So you could be talking, and then you say break. Let go of the radio. Allow anybody else to jump in that might need to jump in for a second. Key back up, and then continue your statements that you need to make. One thing to keep in mind is that radios are subject to interference, and sometimes you might get some static. Somebody may be unclear about what you're saying. Again, I'm going to reiterate, if you're saying something critical on the radio, it's a good idea to say it twice. Repeat it. And if you are on the receiving end of a critical radio transmission, don't just say 10-4. I like to, when I'm responding to someone that's to a critical transmission, I will say something on the lines of Unit 2 copies your code 4, or Unit 2 copies, and I'll repeat a brief summary of what they told me, just to make sure that they know that I also heard it. And it's called affirmative communication or affirmative listening. You're basically repeating back to them what you heard. And if you got it wrong, then they also know that they did not get their point across, and they can retransmit and make sure and clarify. So that's just to avoid miscommunication on the radio. With the newer radios that a lot of law enforcement are using, they're switching to the P25 digital systems or similar, whether it's a Nex Edge or the Motorola Turbo. They basically split the bandwidth of a frequency down to half, and it does tend to come out a little more robotic and digital sounding. And I've noticed that trying to understand people, my radio, I'm on a digital network on this radio, and sometimes if the coverage isn't quite stellar, it goes very digital like the old cell phones used to do, and it's hard to understand what the person said. You've really got to listen, and you got to get used to it. And so critical communications, definitely you should repeat twice before you let go of the button on the radio. Just get your point across. You want to make sure that if it's a critical and you need assistance, you give your location, you give a brief description of what the issue is, and then if it's anything that involves privacy, just say 1021 on mobile, 1021 on at whatever. If you have an extension, 1021 and then give your extension. That way you can also establish a landline link, and you can discuss in privacy what it is you need to say. Radios are not private. Even if you're digital and you are encrypted, it's not always a guarantee that what you're saying is private. There is some level with encryption, but most people don't use encryption on the radios, even digital. You can still pick up a scanner, and you can still listen to what people are saying on the scanner. Law enforcement also, they may encrypt their channels, but the encryption is still not. It's still publicly accessible information, and if you have a scanner that's capable of it, you can enter the encryption code, obtain that key, and still listen to the scanner. So radios in general are not private. So if you have something that's important to say, it's not private. Do a telephone, 1021. Anyway, what are you guys' experience with radios? A lot of security companies tend to avoid radios, or they put guards in places with minimal communications, or just they have their own cell phone, which is a whole different issue. I think radios are an extremely important tool for security. I've always had a radio with me. Even if the company didn't provide it, I always had my own radio with my own repeater service on it that I could reach somebody on, because I was in some pretty remote areas, and let's face it, calling somebody on the phone for help creates a tremendous delay. You gotta look up the number, you gotta dial the number, wait for it to ring, wait for them to pick up, and then you have to communicate. Whereas with a radio, you pick up a button, you pick up the radio, you push a button, and you can instantly start talking, and whoever's on the other end of that radio will instantly start hearing what you're saying. They can go into action immediately. So it does save some time. And then, in a natural disaster, cell phones are not reliable. The network can go down if the network becomes congested. The network can go down completely, and you won't be able to reach anybody. And so radios tend to stay up and running. Even with repeater services, a lot of times they run on their own backup power. So I think radios are a critical component of security as far as the equipment goes. Highly important. And even as an individual security officer, you can have your own radio with your own repeater service, and you can have a family member on the other end. And if that's your only way to communicate an emergency, you have an alternative means of communicating to somebody. So anyway, I'm going to sign off for today. My break's over. I got to go back to work. You have a great day. I'll catch you later. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification bell, and like, comment, and share. Thank you much.